As told to me by my mother, after the war ended, many wives were waiting for their husbands to come home from the fighting. One day, after many years, one of the soldiers returned to his wife and home on a small rural farm in Vietnam. The wife was understandably relieved and happy her husband was alive and well. She ran up the road as he was approaching and embraced him, crying tears of joy. But the husband, seemingly unmoved by her tears, only said, "Wife, make me food." His manner was a little strange, and his voice seemed a little off, but he was her dear husband who just returned from the war when so many had died. She was happy to have him back, and she didn't care, and prepared him a meal. The husband ate and immediately went to bed right after. He slept through the rest of the day and only woke at night to say to his wife, "Wife, make me food." Again, the wife was still so overjoyed about having her husband back after a long absence that she complied. This continued the next day and the day after that. The husband would wake up, tell the wife to prepare him food, eat, and then go back to sleep the whole day. Days began to turn into weeks. The wife worked to maintain the farm, but as the couple was poor in the first place, and now all the husband did was eat and sleep, she was running out of food for them both. She noticed that her husband's voice sounded deeper, as if not his own, and he was not behaving like his usual self. The wife began to become frightened and desperate. She called upon the local Catholic priest for help. He came and observed the husband, finally saying to the wife, "This man is not your husband. Some spirit has taken possession of his body." The wife screamed out in shock and fear, but the only thing to do was to exorcise the spirit or whatever it was inside her husband. The priest waited until nightfall, when the husband usually woke, to demand food from his wife. "Wife, make me food." But instead of his wife, there stood the priest. The priest quickly performed the exorcism ritual, and the husband fell to the ground, the body decomposing rapidly into nothing but dust. The husband was long dead. The spirit must have found his body and used it to live a semblance of a life. The wife was lucky it was not a malevolent spirit or demon that wanted to do her harm. My mother told me that stories like this were common after the war, that some of the soldiers who returned were not the same ones who left loved ones behind. You had to watch closely for telltale signs of spirit possession, such as a deeper voice that doesn't belong to the person, or that he or she just wants to keep eating. Two things my mother and I both noticed that many Vietnamese ghost stories have in common.
So this is a story my grandmother told me a few months ago. My grandmother is not overtly spiritual or paranoid, and she does not make up stories. She's a no-nonsense type of lady, and so I truly believe every word of this story. My grandmother's grandmother, my great-great-grandmother of course, was said to have been cursed with the evil eye, I believe she called it. Every time she went near a church, she would go into some kind of fit, almost like a seizure. Her husband, my great-great-grandfather, seeking to help her allergy, came to possess some kind of book that detailed many rituals for different occasions. I do not know the specifics of this book or how he came to find it. Neither does my grandma. People don't like to talk about this. He and his good friend apparently went into the woods one day to perform one of the rituals in the hopes of curing this evil eye. But something must have gone seriously fucking wrong. My great-great-grandfather's friend died that day in the woods. I believe he had a heart attack, and my great-great-grandfather himself went insane. He literally spent the rest of his life in an insane asylum. He must have dropped the book in the woods, because he didn't have it with him when he came running out. That's the extent of the info I could get out of my grandmother. Though I did learn later that my great-great-grandmother was exorcised, and since then she was able to enter churches no problem. Like I said, I believe in every word of this story, and it still creeps me way out.
So this happened to me when I was about 11 or 12. My brother and I were home alone, and while he was on the first floor watching TV, I was on the third floor in my room. My house is a two-family home, and my grandparents live next door to us. And the third floor in our house has two small rooms in it. Both rooms were considered to be mine, but one of them had my bed and the other had my dresser, desk, etc. Anyway, I had a small dollhouse that was set up in my bedroom, and I was playing with it. It was set up against the wall, though, so I couldn't see the door behind me when I was playing. Now, my house is very echoey, so you can hear pretty much anything that happens. We also have very little carpet, so it only causes more creaks and echoes throughout the house. The set of stairs leading up to the third floor are the loudest of all of them. So even if the door to my room is closed, I can clearly hear if someone is coming up behind me. At this point, I could also hear that my brother was watching TV on the first floor, and I could clearly hear what characters were saying what as well. I had been playing for about an hour when I suddenly heard 3 very fast, distinct claps right behind me. It sounded like whoever had just done this couldn't have been more than a foot behind me. I turned my head around so fast, expecting to see somebody, but no one was there. I stood up and ran down the stairs as fast as I could, screaming. My brother was just as scared because he had no idea who could have done it, since he'd been downstairs the entire time. To this day, I still don't know what or who clapped, but I don't think I'll ever forget it.
I first heard the story when I was in college. I had come home for winter break, and I remember it was just me and my dad in the house. I was watching some kind of ghost hunters program on TV, just for laughs. I don't really believe in that stuff. When you watch the programs on the TV, they're just so obviously fake. It's too hard for me to let go of my preconceptions and just watch it and try and get into it. My dad was the same way, so I thought. He didn't seem interested in the paranormal or anything. He was the kind of guy who would scoff at anything supernatural. The program I was watching flipped to a commercial, and I casually got up and found my dad in the kitchen. Sort of out of the blue, I asked him, "Hey Dad, do you believe in ghosts?" "Yup." His reply was so casual it shocked me. "Really?" I asked, just a bit taken aback. "Like, it just doesn't seem like you." He shrugged his shoulders and mulled over what I had just said. "Yeah," he replied eventually. "But I know ghosts are real. I've met one." Upon hearing this statement, I had to know the story. You see, my dad is like me. He likes to tell stories. I could retell most of his stories from memory, just because he would tell them so frequently, to anyone who would listen. Yet here was a story I had never heard of an event that changed my dad's life. To this day, I don't know if I believe it or not. But when someone who is so influential in your life, someone who seems so logical and so down to earth, tells you something like this, it calls into question what you believe and why. Though he never brings it up, when I talk to him about it, he swears it's completely true, no exaggeration, and no doubt in his mind what happened. Here it is, told from his point of view. It was back in the house in Tacoma where you grew up until you were about 4. My parents lived in the house, but I was going to college. I was back visiting them for a weekend. I was just over at Tacoma Community College, so it wasn't far away. I came back to visit often and get a home-cooked meal. I remember that I was sitting down for dinner with my parents, just the 3 of us. It was the late spring, early summer season, so it hadn't gotten dark out yet. We were talking like normal when the phone rang in the kitchen. My mom got up and answered the phone, leaving my dad and me in the room together alone. After a short while, she called my dad into the kitchen as well. "Leo, can you come in here for a moment?" I remember she seemed worried. Her voice was shaking a bit. My dad wiped his face, got up, and joined my mom in the kitchen. They weren't in there for long, but they were talking quietly, and it felt strange. After a few moments, they came out of the kitchen. They had their coats on now. "Something's come up. We have to go out for a bit," my mom said. "There's dessert in the fridge. Help yourself. Don't worry about the dishes. I'll wash them when we get back." My dad said nothing, but I could tell from his face that it was serious. My mom looked genuinely worried. They were out the door in a flash, and I was left to finish my dinner at the table. I cleared the table, washed my plate, despite Mom's instructions. Then I went into the main room to read. I sat down on the sofa and opened one of my school books and began to relax. Hours went by, and my parents still hadn't come back yet. It was now around 11 o'clock, and I was just about to get ready for bed. I walked up the stairs, making my way into the bathroom, when I heard a strange noise. I paused and listened for a while. It was the ceiling. The ceiling was making a slow, drawn-out whining noise. The wood was creaking gently. It wasn't an unusual sound, but there was an unusual rhythm to it that made me uncomfortable and curious. After listening a while, I pulled down the steps to the attic and listened a bit more. I could hear the sound more clearly now, although with a metallic creaking noise. I gathered up my courage and decided to investigate. I climbed the steps. Now I have to say, I wasn't scared. I didn't have an uneasy feeling. Actually, to the contrary, I felt quite comfortable. Even though it was dark and eerie, the energy in the room wasn't foreboding. It felt almost warm and inviting. As I looked around the attic, it quickly became obvious where the sound was coming from. Among the boxes and various other storage, there was an old rocking chair, one that belonged to my grandmother. It was one of the many possessions she had left with us at the house. She was in a nearby home for the elderly and couldn't fit much of her belongings in her room. The rocking chair was gently rocking back and forth, causing the floorboards to creak beneath it. Next to the chair, an old bird cage was displaying a similar behavior. The cage door was gently swinging open and closed, making a quiet metallic creak. I figured there was a draft, and knowing the sounds would keep me up all night if I didn't put an end to it. I set out in search of the source. I combed the corners of the room, but try as I might, I couldn't find the source of the draft, nor could I feel it myself. There were no windows, and there wasn't much ventilation. It wasn't even windy outside. It was a calm evening. Furthermore, the chair was heavy, as was the birdcage, yet there were other things nearby that weren't disturbed. A stack of papers and the like. After a while, I gave up and looked back at the chair. It was still gently rocking. I walked over to it and rested my hand on the armrest. The chair stopped rocking. Still, I couldn't feel any kind of draft. I lifted my hand and the chair was calm and quiet. But as I turned away, I heard the creaking again. I turned back and the chair was still rocking. It was really strange, but as I had said before, I wasn't really creeped out. I shrugged it off and walked over to the birdcage. The door was still slowly swinging open and closed. The cage had once housed a parrot belonging to my grandmother, but it had been empty now for some time. I latched the cage shut, figuring I could at least stop this one sound. I made for the steps, but just as I was about halfway down, I heard the metallic creaking again. I looked behind me, and the cage door was back to it, swinging open, unlatched, right alongside the chair, which continued rocking as before. Something had caused it to unlatch. I was sure I had latched it properly. In any other circumstance, I would have been scared out of my mind, but for whatever reason, I wasn't. I just didn't feel uneasy. A rocking chair and a birdcage aren't really the harbingers of doom anyway. I descended from the attic with the last glance at the strange behavior and went about my bedtime routine. The creaking continued for a while, and I couldn't sleep for it. I went back downstairs to where I couldn't hear the noise and continued reading. It was a little after midnight when I heard my parents pull into the driveway. They came in and found me reading, and they sat down with me. Mom was crying. They explained to me that they had just spent the evening at the hospital where my grandmother had just passed away. That's the story as my dad tells it. He believes that to this day, before she left this world, his grandmother came home to pay him one last visit.
This is one of the most terrifying things to have happened to me. Although, after writing it and reading it over, it doesn't sound as scary as I remember it. Anyways, here it is. We live on the top floor of an old apartment building in a college town. The apartments have been there for many years. They're dark, with dark carpet, long hallways, and no light fixtures in the bedrooms. Our bedroom is the largest, and it's at the end of the long hallway. My wife insists on sleeping with the door closed, and our bedroom is also the darkest room in the apartment. It has one window, which overlooks the parking lot, and our bed sits in the middle of the floor. My wife sleeps on the side that faces the window, and I have the side that faces the closet. We sleep with the fan on to provide some white noise as well. At night, our bedroom is even darker. With the blinds closed and the blackout curtains, a small amount of glow comes through from the parking lot street lamps. On this particular night, I awoke from a very sound sleep at around 2 a.m. The room was barely illuminated, as usual, by the streetlights, and the constant humming of the fan always plays tricks on my mind. I hear things, faint noises sometimes, whispers, buzzing, and popping, almost every night, and I just tell myself that it's in your head. I was laying in bed, half awake, trying to remember if my son had sent me his nightly text. I reached into my nightstand and picked up my phone. The time was just after 2 a.m., and I confirmed that he did text me. But then I noticed that the air in the bedroom was heavy. I was hearing whispers and the white noise again. Just gibberish, really. While lying on my back, I had imagined seeing tiny little lights blinking on the ceiling. These lights seemed to illuminate a human-looking face in the textured plaster. This had to be my imagination. But for some reason, I really felt scared and vulnerable, for lack of a better word. At this time, I rolled over and spooned my wife. She was lying on her right side, facing the window. Holding her warm, little body close to mine was always a comfort. Lying on my side now, I opened my eyes and immediately thought I could be seeing something different about the window. I blinked hard and took another look. I could distinctly make out a very tall, dark humanoid shape standing inside the bedroom, in front of the window, partially obscured by curtains. I was immediately fucking terrified. I blinked again, but when I took another look, my worst fears were confirmed. The figure sidestepped into the center of the window. Being slightly illuminated from behind, I could see that it was tall, dark, and large, but non-human, creating a complete panic in the air. Thinking that this was just ridiculous, I blinked again. When I opened my eyes this time, the monster was one step closer to the bed. It was within 15 feet of me. I blinked again. It was a step closer. I started screaming and shaking my wife. She couldn't wake up. It was now one step closer, and I was completely losing my shit. I shook my wife hard and screamed her name again. "Turn on the light! Turn on the light!" I screamed, and I kept screaming. It was standing right beside the bed now. She startled awake and turned on her bedside lamp. It instantly disappeared, and there was nothing there. I was completely out of breath and gasping for air. My pulse was rapid. I was too terrified to be embarrassed, and my hands were trembling. She held me until I calmed down. I told her what I'd seen, and she believed me. She always does. I have similar things happen to me my entire life. Something had always followed me from when I was a child. From the bedroom of my childhood home, to my first apartment, to my first house, and every home since then. It doesn't sound too bad now that I've reread it, but that night, when it happened, I was a mess. And it was real.
Please do not add my name. All others have already been changed due to HIPAA, and I am not allowed to give out patient info. I give this site permission to use the following true story. I have always felt compelled to help others. I actually find pleasure in doing so. So becoming a fourth-generation nurse was right in line with my life's purpose. Before finishing my degree in general health science, I chose to be a CNA for a bit to get my feet wet. This story is my first encounter on such a level. Since I was small, I've always been able to sense things before they happened. I've even had dreams of winning lotto numbers. I could sense a presence, but never seen one. One of my favorite patients was named Rose. She was a feisty Italian woman that lived half of her life in New York. Being from Washington, D.C. myself, we clicked well in this small, dirty road town in Virginia. Rose was a Catholic. She loved her religion. I am a Baptist, so we had respect for one another. I cared for Rose for almost a year before her dementia started to peek its head. She began to need constant supervision, so her room was moved closer to the nursing station. Fast forward a week before Rose passed away one night, I was working doing my rounds. I felt as if someone down the hall was staring at me. I turned around only to see an older man smiling at me right before he turned and walked into Rose's room. I ran down the hall yelling, "Hey! Hey!" When I turned in her room, she was fast asleep, and her rocking chair she loved was rocking back and forth. I could feel a presence. Having a religious background, I just started to pray while walking around her room. Keep in mind, at this time I was only 23, but very aware of the beyond. The next morning upon waking Rose, she asked me who the man was standing at her bed all night. With dementia, it's said not to tell them they're seeing things, etc. So I just told Rose I must have missed him. That night, I returned for my 11 to 7 shift, and around 1 a.m., Rose began screaming, "No! No! Get out of my room!" I ran as fast as I could. I saw nothing, but Rose was pointing past me saying, "You tell him I'm Catholic! No man should be in my room!" I turned around, holding her hand, and I said firmly, "You, in the name of our God, get out of here!" I turned to Rose. She smiled and said, "Thank you." 2 nights later, I was scheduled to work. I was happy to see Rose, but the CNA I was relieving told me the night before Rose had started screaming, "Get out," over and over. The nurse had to give her a medicine to make her sleep. I asked the CNA, "Did anyone pray?" She looked at me strange and said no. After that, Rose had gone silent. Now, she just stared. What I should mention is when Rose was a teen, she denounced her religion. It was only her. Last 2 years, she was redacting her life. She would cuss like a New York sailor. God, she made me laugh. I loved her. I went in to see Rose, hoping she would speak to me. I prayed and kissed her forehead. It was a silent night. That morning was my last time seeing Rose. As I brushed her hair, Rose looked up at me and then turned and pointed. I slowly followed her gaze and finger. I began to get chills as I slowly looked to the corner. I dropped the brush. I inhaled so deep I thought my lungs were going to burst. I couldn't breathe. No way. What I saw was impossible. Rose started screaming this horrible scream like of pain, horrible pain. The man thing stood there not moving, just there. The face was like a black circle. It had no features. It had on men's clothing, just like what the man had on from nights before. The nurse ran in, calling Rose's name, trying to calm her. I was frozen. It was still there. I snapped out of it and just started saying Jesus over and over. Suddenly Rose stopped screaming and the thing was gone. We got Rose back into bed to rest. I rubbed her hair and said, "Rose, I have to go, but you have to pray for yourself. Can you understand me?" She did not reply. As I stood to walk out, she uttered, "Thank you for love." I said, "No, thank you." That night I rushed in to see her. I was told she had passed only moments after I left. She said before she passed, she told the other CNA, "I know who he is." A few weeks later, it still bothered me of what I saw. So one night I decided to tell one of the ladies that's been working there for almost 30 years. She told me they call the unit I worked on the graveyard. I asked why. She said because there's spirits that haunt it. She began to show me old pictures of prior residents. As she flicked the pages, she was telling a story of this one bad spirit that the patients named the Reaper Man, because he only appeared just days before death. At that moment, I looked down at the pictures and there he was. I looked closer. I asked, "Who is this man?" She said, "That's John. He died 2 years ago. He was a hateful man and hated everyone. But days before his death, he started screaming,
'No, you can't take me!'
All day he yelled it. They found him with his mouth wide open, eyes huge, and fists clenched. I asked, 'What room did he die in?' She said, 'He died in the graveyard room, room 23. Room 23 was Rose's room." Update. The next day of me writing this, I saw 23 everywhere. Clocks, machines, even license plates. The stories I will be posting are hopefully to help others that share the same gift I do. Do not be afraid to help people. There will be naysayers, people that won't believe, and it's only because they themselves have not experienced what we have. People tend to fear or try to disclaim what they have not seen or know anything about. All my life, I've allowed such people to keep me quiet, ignoring the help I could be offering. Now, with God and strength, I'm no longer ashamed nor afraid. Be well and be blessed. I've had quite a few paranormal experiences over the years, and they all come from my grandma's house, where she's lived all my life. I used to stay there quite a bit as a child, and lived there from 18 to 20. Most, but not all of the experiences happened in the basement. For a little bit of information, it's fully furnished with 2 bedrooms, a living room, a kitchen, and a bathroom. There was almost always some strange noise or feeling, but I'll tell you about some of the more memorable. I had my bed up against the wall. It was a queen, I believe. I was laying on the very edge facing the wall and talking to my girlfriend on the phone. While I was talking, the center of the bed slowly depressed, as if someone had laid down next to me. I was pretty freaked out. When I looked behind me, nothing was there. After a few minutes, it went back up, like whatever it was had gotten up. Another time, while alone in the house, I was upstairs in the computer room playing games. It was directly above my room, and they shared a vent. As I was playing, I started to hear voices coming up through the vent. They started to get louder and change pitch and tone rapidly. Once I heard a laugh track, I realized it was my TV. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen, thinking somebody might have broken in. When I got down to my room, nobody was there, and the TV was off and unplugged. I grabbed my keys and I left as fast as I could. Once, I woke up in the middle of the night from a deep sleep. It took me a few seconds to realize that the reason I woke up was because my bed was shaking. I actually just went back to sleep on that one. Too tired. Another time, as I was leaving, I heard Grandma's normally quiet, lazy cat running all over the house, hissing and screaming. I looked over at the patio door where the cat was, and I saw a tennis ball-sized ball of light outside. As the cat jumped on it, it floated down lazily in a zigzag pattern, and then shot up very quickly and shot around the side of the house. When I went outside to see if I could see it, it was gone. It wasn't just me that had things happen, though. I once had a friend see a face floating in a dark, empty room. My uncle, once when he was alone downstairs, heard footsteps and followed them from the back of the house all the way to the basement steps. When he went to see who it was, no one was there. My girlfriend at the time even saw something once. She stayed the night once, shortly after my grandpa passed away. Grandma wasn't going to let us stay in the same room, so she slept upstairs in Grandpa's old room. She couldn't sleep. At one point, she looked in the mirror next to the bed and saw a man standing behind her. The person she described was my grandfather. who she had never met. My grandpa's first wife, Wilma, was a severe alcoholic. She would go into her room and drink and make loud coughing noises to cover up the sound of the brown paper it came in. She died in the house, I think, after drinking bleach. After she was gone, Grandpa said sometimes he still heard the coughing. There was always something creepy going on in that house, but the worst part had to be the basement stairs. When leaving the basement, it always felt like someone was right behind you. It got to the point where I would either walk with my back to the wall up the stairs, or I would sprint up as quickly as I could. I have more stories from that house, and maybe I'll share them later, but this is getting kind of long, so I'll leave off here for now.
Hello there. For some reason, I recently decided to share my most terrifying experiences. I've been a long-time reader of Reddit and never posted anything until a few days ago. I can give you guys links to my other stories if you like. So, my cousin's old house is haunted. We used to be really close when we were younger, sleepovers every weekend, shit like that. We are still close, but don't hang out as much, which sucks, but what can you do? It's always been strange to me that nothing ever happened or I ever noticed anything paranormal in that house all the years I've been going over there. One night left a memory in my brain I will never forget. I believe it was in 8th or 9th grade at the time. We were doing our usual weekend sleep, and this time it was at his house. It's in Aura, Colorado. His parents went to some party after the tournament, so they weren't going to be back even later. They were in their late 30s at the time. I don't know how they partied so much. So we're taking turns playing the single-player game on the PlayStation 2, I believe it was. I think this game was Kingdom Hearts, if anyone cares. So it's his turn, and I'm watching him play when I hear a noise come from the air vent that leads to his room upstairs. The upstairs had this room and another room they used for a computer. I told him to pause the game because I had heard something. He paused the game and we sat there in silence for about 20 seconds. Then, clear as day, we hear a girl crying through the air vent. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. So I just sat there and stared at the vent. To describe the cry, imagine the witch from the video game Left 4 Dead, but younger, if that makes any sense. I started tearing up and asked my cousin what the hell was going on. He told me the previous owners had moved because their daughter had committed suicide in the upstairs area. His parents didn't ask how, so don't ask me how the girl did it. Anyways, the crying went on and off, so we went and sat outside on the front porch. He said it only lasts for about 10 to 15 minutes and then it stops. I'm still freaking out and shocked he isn't scared at all. He told me, you get used to it. He also said it didn't happen that often either. We go back inside after 20 minutes or so and it's silent. I'm relieved the crying has stopped, but it was still an eerie silence. I rushed to the kitchen to use his telephone to call my mom to pick me up. There was no way I was staying there. I didn't care what time it was. Fortunately, nothing else happened the whole time I waited for my mom, which was about 30 minutes. I was paranoid the entire time. He said he never told me because he didn't want me to be scared and he didn't want me to not want to hang out with him. Honestly, I would have felt better knowing. Surprisingly, my mom never knew either. I felt bad leaving him there alone, but he said he'd be fine. His parents were on their way home after we left, thankfully. He moved a couple years later to a new house, which was nice because we had always had sleepovers at my house because I didn't want to go back. They said they moved because they wanted something bigger. I guess they were used to it. Has anybody else experienced anything similar? I'd love to hear it. Thanks.
This story didn't happen to me, but to a friend of my family. To be specific, my father's friend from his teen years. I didn't believe them the first time they told me, but years after experiencing my own supernatural events, I don't have any reason not to. Just a little background. My father and his friend, who I will name John just for privacy, used to be interested into demonic and satanic things like music, symbols, and even so far as to attempt to make contact with otherworldly beings. I'm not a religious or spiritual person, but something about this story gives me chills just recalling it. My father told me one day him and John were trying to talk to demons. Yes, not just spirits, but beings claiming to be actual demons. According to both of them, they were messing with one of those Ouija boards, calling dark beings in my dad's old house in East LA. They said nothing really scary happened, and they actually enjoyed talking to the so-called demon until the one they spoke to at the end of the session. See, John said to my dad that they should try to reach a spirit that has been known to them in their research in the darkness of the unknown. I honestly don't remember what they said it was called, but I remember it started with a Z. They said they asked it many questions about the past, present, and future. They never told me exactly what they were asking this being, but what they told me were the events right after they said goodbye. My father said as soon as it said goodbye, he heard something moving in his backyard. John and my dad got scared, most likely from the energy surrounding them. My father, being the one who always had a curious mind, even till this day, wanted to see what was causing the noise. Him and John walked quietly to the back door, and while getting closer, they were able to hear clearly what the noise was. Each step made the movement sound like rocking and creaking. Right as my dad grasped the handle of the back door, they heard a sound that a horse would make while riding around. Both of them, now creeped out, but confused and more curious than ever, opened the door and slowly walked out of the doorway. My father was the first one to notice it. He said that as he laid his eyes on it, chills ran up his whole body. What he saw was an old toddler's rocking horse his family had for years. Yes, an old vintage rocking horse gave my father and John chills. It wasn't the rocking horse that scared them, but how it changed from the way they knew it looked. To them, the horse's eyes were a glowing blood red, staring directly at them, that have always been a dark brown to my dad. It rocked without any signs of slowing down, just a constant rocking. They both turned back and locked the door as fast as they could. That was the first time my father said he's been through that, but he said it continued for 5 months, around the same time every night. Though it creeped him out, nothing too scary or harmful ever occurred until the incident that happened to John, the day after the rocking horse suddenly stopped. My father was the first to tell me about it. I later asked John to make sure my dad wasn't just messing with me, but he also told me the same exact story. It went as follows. One night, John and his girlfriend were talking on the phone, as they did every night, about random subjects and daily duties. At some point, they started talking about the supernatural and the unknown. It was a very normal conversation to them. According to John's girlfriend, he was acting strange and somewhat paranoid, talking about the subject that night. This story is from John's girlfriend's point of view. She said that she slowly started to hear voices from multiple beings that started as distant whispers. She asked John if anyone else was home with him or in the same room, but John said no one was home with him. though he felt like he was being watched. As John kept talking about how he had been feeling strange since him and my father first saw the horse rocking, his girlfriend said the distant whispers began to get louder and louder, to the point that she thought it was a prank that John, my dad, and another friend were pulling on her. Yet, every time she asked John about the voices, he swore he didn't hear them. Till this day, he denies hearing any voices, just the feeling of eyes on him and a deep dark energy around him. John's girlfriend kept hearing the voices getting louder than John himself. She wasn't able to hear John at all anymore, just multiple voices talking fast and what didn't sound like English or Spanish, the only languages they both knew. Scared out of her mind, she hung up and called the police to be sent to John's house. She told them about what happened before John's voice stopped. She drove to his house to make sure he was all right. She drove up as the police and ambulance were entering the house. She waited outside for news of John. When she saw the paramedics pushing a stretcher towards the house, her heart dropped and fear rose. Less than 5 minutes later, they were pushing him out with a pump to help him breathe. She ran to see him to make sure he was all right. The police stopped her few feet before she got to him and asked why she was running towards him. She told them she was the person who called them to check on him, and they took a statement from her. They told her that she might have saved his life. When he wasn't answering, they broke down the door and found John on the floor convulsing like he was having a seizure while still holding the phone in his hand. John was perfectly fine after. He woke up the next day and didn't remember much from the night before. The paramedics that helped him said he had a seizure, but very mild, that only caused minor harm. They also estimated he'd been having it for 15 minutes before stopping, after being touched by one of the paramedics on the scene. I'm glad to say John and my dad never have been through something as scary again, and both are in good health. I don't know if I believe them, but the way they speak of those times with such fear, regret and worriness in their voices, it's kind of hard not to believe them. I can say that this probably began when I was about 7 years old. For as long as I can remember, there was this girl who looked about 12 years old that would always appear to me in my childhood home. My family moved into this house a little before my 7th birthday, and that is when I first recall seeing her. This girl was very thin and lanky. She had short, choppy hair, as if someone had butchered it, and was dirty looking. She wore a dress I would consider grungy and was once white, always barefoot. As a child, I was always an early riser. On Saturday mornings, I was usually up around 5:30 or 6 a.m. for some reason. I had to be that annoying child that would wake my mother up to turn the TV on for me, as this was an older set that didn't have a remote control. Our house had a bit of a weird layout. The previous owners of the house had made an additional 2 rooms to the back of the house that were to be our dining room and TV room. This room had a connecting sliding door directly to my parents' room. Like clockwork, every Saturday, I would make my way down the hall to my parents' room, wake my mom to turn on the TV, but always made her leave the sliding door open so she could watch me, but in reality, she always went back to sleep. I knew this, but still felt comforted that I could run through the open sliding door instead of going through the kitchen and down the long hall to her bedroom. I never told my mom, but it was because the lanky girl would follow me. She didn't constantly follow me all day long, but would randomly appear in places where it was unexpected. The first time I saw her, I had gone to the restroom early in the morning and was making my way back to the TV room when I saw her out of the corner of my eye. She was sitting crouched in between the stove in the kitchen and the wall to the TV room. This was maybe a 2-foot wide space. She didn't say anything to me, but stared at me wide-eyed when I turned to look at her. She disappeared into thin air before my eyes. Me, being the small child I was, turned and ran into my parents' room and jumped into bed with them. I didn't mutter a word to either one of them. After that, she would just pop up in the TV room early on Saturday mornings and just sit at the end of the couch, not looking at the TV, just staring straight. She never attempted to talk to me and rarely looked at me, and if she did, it was a blank stare. As years went on, she began to appear in other places. In this house, there was a full floor-to-ceiling mirror at the end of the hall, and let me share that I hated walking the hall by myself, as she would walk behind me quite a bit. Just typing it gives me goosebumps. I never really looked up, but learned to count the steps to the bedrooms. When I was 11, we finally moved out of the house, and I didn't see her for quite a while, until I was about 20 and had quietly, frankly forgotten about her. Until one day, when I was putting some stuff away and walked into my parents' room, and there she was. Same position as I had first seen her, on my parents' bed. She didn't look as old to me anymore as she initially did, given that when we first met, she was about 4 years older than me, and I was now 9 years older than her. There she was, in the same grungy dress and choppy hair, saying nothing, but giving me that blank stare. I have to admit that when I opened the bedroom door and saw her there, I noped the fuck out of that one. She had been gone for so many years. Why she was back and how she found me was beyond me. Never spoke to her or asked her what she wanted. Just said nope and walked back out of that room. It's been 12 years since I've last seen her. Not sure if she is yet to find me again. I think after all the other experiences I've had, if she appears again, I will have to try to communicate, especially after so many years.
My old house had a living room and a dining music room with the kitchen in the middle. The way it was set up, you could walk through the living room and around the bar stools and counters to get to the kitchen. This was the long way. Or through the dining room straight to the kitchen. Ever since I was a kid, I would go all the way around to the kitchen to the living room because the dining room creeped me out. I always felt like I was being watched or something in that room. Fast forward about 5 years ago. I came back home to visit from college and brought a Ouija board that I had found in my grandpa's house. I laughed because I didn't believe in them, but I brought it home because I thought it was old and it was pretty cool. My mom was not happy that I brought it into the house, but after a lot of begging, she played with me. Nothing happened, just the typical funny answers to how old are you, will I get married, or whatever. A few days later, my friend and I played. It was all fun and games until one of the answers gave us chills. The questions we asked were, When did you die, and how did you die? I don't remember the specifics, but it answered that he died in the mid-1800s, and the disease was an acronym of some sort. I remember it started with an E. My friend and I had no clue what it meant and assumed it meant nothing, but for shits and giggles we googled the acronym. What I do remember is finding that it was a real acronym for a disease in the 1800s that caused from bacteria consumed by eating chicken. I kid you not. Neither one of us had ever heard of it. I just texted her and she doesn't remember the name either, just that it had to do with chickens. She and I put the Ouija board away after that, but I was fascinated, so I took the Ouija board back to college with me for my roommates and I to mess with. Back at college I got a phone call from my mom, who was freaked out. She's a level-headed woman and wouldn't joke around about this. She said every night she wakes up in the middle of the night and the lights are on in the dining room. She lived alone at the time. She asked me if I said goodbye to the spirit when I played the stupid board. I told her no, and she begged me to come back home the following weekend with the board. I was going to college 4 hours away, but she was sincerely spooked and I was always homesick, so I came home the next weekend. Back at home, she and I said goodbye to the spirit. That night I heard voices whispering. I was confused because we lived where we had no neighbors close by. I got up and looked around, but no one was there, so I went back to sleep. I woke up in the morning and the dining room lights were on. I told my mom about the voices and she told me that she had been hearing the whispers at night too. Anyways, my mom left for work and I was home alone. Even though the room still creeped me out, the dining room has my piano in it, so I sat on the bench, put on my headphones, and started playing piano to one of my favorite songs. I felt like someone was watching me, but I kept playing. I have one of those traditional metronome things that you have to unclip and start ticking, and I was playing, and I watched it unclip and start to tick. I ripped my headphones out and noped the fuck out of there. It was eerie listening to the slow tick, tick, tick as I left. I grabbed my keys and spent the afternoon at work with my mom. When we got home, Mom unplugged the lights in the dining room and we kind of avoided that room altogether. A few months later, my mom moved from our house. She hasn't had anything happen since.
First time poster, long time lurker. I only recently found this subreddit and figured my story belongs here. So let's get to it. When I was about 6, my sister was about 10. I had a lot of dolls, a lot of toys to play with, and frequently left them laying about. My family was in the middle of moving, so I had to pack up all my toys. I specifically remember packing up my favorite doll, because I packed her last because I wanted to see her when I first got to our new house. She was a regular baby doll with these big painted on eyes. Well, I spent about an hour helping pack stuff up when I heard my mom yelling at me about not packing up my shit. She came into the living room waving my doll around. I remember her saying if I won't treat my toys any better than that, I won't get any more. I swore to her up and down that I packed it and that I was sorry, normal kid in trouble stuff. The creepy part is when my sister decided to pick on me though, my mom laid down for a nap and my dad went to get a pizza for us all. My sister was fighting with me like usual and decided to throw the baby doll from earlier down the stairs. I ran over and she was beside me, taunting me like siblings do. I was about to run down the stairs when I saw the head of my doll turn and wink at me. Remember, it was painted on eyes. My sister saw it too, and we were both too scared to move, so we left it there and closed the door. We tried telling my dad, but he just blew it off. It was just a stress from the move. There's been other mundane stuff that happened in that house that could be considered creepy, but nothing too fancy. So what do you think? Just a trick of the mind, or maybe something more paranormal? My sister still swears she saw it too. River Ghost. So this is a true story. I have a lot that went on in my life, and not all of it bad, but this one cut me to the core of my soul. My sister and I always played and had fun, along with our little brother. Sometimes he was just too little to do things with us. My older sister and I would go down to the river and throw rocks in for one of the dogs. The other would stay next to me. He hated the water. Keep this in mind. It was like most days that we did this. She loved the times we stayed there and talked. But this day we didn't talk too much. I was thinking she had something on her mind or was mad. She was about to say something and covered my mouth. She then pointed over to something across the river. It was big and dark. I wanted to scream. She pulled me close to her and we started to walk backwards up the incline of the hill. I looked over as both of the dogs we had with us moved in front of the two of us. My little dog, the little shit that hated the water, ran into the river at the thing. The older dog went after him too. We both looked on as the shadow thing ran off. My sister and I started to keep a shotgun with us as we went down there. Yeah, 2 kids with a shotgun. But keep in mind, it was the 90s and we lived in a little town in Colorado. So this was nothing new. But after this, we saw the thing only one other time in the winter. This time we had my brother with us, and we had been looking forward to walking on the ice for most of the year. The ice on the river was always deep, and sometimes had parts in the ice that looked like little hills. It was uneven, and we would lose footing here and there. My brother was the one that saw it first. He was running ahead of me and my sister, like little boys love to do. He stopped as both dogs started to growl. His little puppy, he had just got the dog and named it Baby, an Irish wolfhound named Baby. Stories with her will come later. The thing looked over at us and started to come at us. We could see it better than the last time. It was a walking shadow with glowing eyes. It did not run as the dog both pulled at my little brother and started to run. Yes, we ran on uneven ice. We did slide and fall 1 or 2 times. We got to the side of the hill next to the river and looking back and it was gone. We started not going over to that part of the river. We did find out that about 100 years ago, that part of the river was one of the fishing grounds of an old tribe. Before we moved, I had started to look into being a pagan more, but never told my mother or others. I went down to that part and put sage and a little fish